The medical ship Asterio floated in the silence of deep space, a hub of cutting-edge technology and unmatched expertise in healing. Its crew, a collective of highly trained physicians from the Zephyr species, took pride in their mastery of biology and their delicate but precise touch in medical matters. The Zephyr were slender beings with semi-translucent skin, their fragile forms emphasizing their reliance on intellect over physical resilience. For centuries, their advanced treatments had made them the galaxy's most sought-after healers. Today, however, they faced a peculiar challenge: humanity. Recently inducted into the Intergalactic Alliance, humans were the subject of much curiosity and quiet skepticism. The Zephyr had studied humans from afar, noting their origins on a so-called Deathworld, a term reserved for planets with harsh conditions, predatory ecosystems, and relentless dangers. It was almost unthinkable that any intelligent species could evolve under such conditions. The Zephyr found the classification fascinating but doubted its implications. After all, humans seemed small, soft, and unremarkable by intergalactic standards. They didn't even possess natural bioarmor like the reptilian Varric or regenerative capabilities like the aquatic Lyrathians. As the ship's chief physician, Dr. Sci-Fi, reviewed the initial reports on human physiology, she couldn't hide her skepticism. Their cardiovascular system is overworked, their bones too rigid, and their immune responses chaotic. And yet they claim to survive extremes without advanced medical intervention. It's a paradox. Her assistant, Kellier, adjusted his holoscreen, displaying a rotating 3D model of human anatomy. Perhaps their survival is exaggerated, Doctor. Deathworlders or not, their biology appears haphazard. Surely it's their technology compensating for these inefficiencies. Their musings were interrupted by the sharp chime of a distress call. A holographic display lit up the room with details from a human mining ship in their vicinity. Explosions had rocked the vessel, leaving a significant portion of the crew injured. The Asterio was the closest medical ship, and they were obligated to respond. The Zephyr prepared with precision, their medkits calibrated for delicate interventions. Sci-Fi briefed her team, her tone measured. Remember, humans are untested in our care. We approach them as we would any fragile species, assume their limits are far below ours. The Asterio docked alongside the mining ship, and the team disembarked into a scene of chaos. Smoke lingered in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of scorched metal. Human voices filled the space, shouting instructions and cracking jokes despite the evident destruction. It was a jarring contrast to the Zephyr's usual patience, who would typically retreat into silence during such crises. The first human they encountered was a miner sitting on a crate near the airlock. His jumpsuit was scorched, exposing reddened skin, and his left arm hung at an odd angle, clearly fractured. Yet, instead of the expected groans of pain, he grinned as they approached. "Ah, you must be the space doctors," he said, his voice light despite the situation. "Before you start poking around, any chance you've got coffee on that fancy ship of yours? I'd kill for a cup." Sci-Fi blinked, her translucent eyelids fluttering in disbelief. Kellier, ever professional, activated a diagnostic scanner and began cataloging the man's injuries. Burns covered nearly 20% of his visible skin, and the fracture in his arm would render most species immobile with pain. "You're in shock," Sci-Fi stated, her voice clipped. "We need to stabilize you immediately before." The miner waved her off with his good hand. "Shock? Nah, Doc, this is just Tuesday. You should have seen the time I fell off a loading rig. This is nothing." The team exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of confusion and unease. Sci-Fi attempted to reason with him. "Your injuries require immediate attention. Without proper treatment—" "Relax," the miner interrupted, his grin never faltering. "Patch me up, and I'll be good as new. Trust me, we're tougher than we look." Sci-Fi stepped back, her professional demeanor intact but her mind reeling. Was this bravado? Denial? Or were humans genuinely this impervious? The triage process was chaos, though not in the way the Zephyr expected. The humans, with their soot-streaked faces and torn uniforms, were far from the fragile beings the alien doctors had prepared to handle. Instead of meekly submitting to care, they displayed a bizarre mix of stubbornness and humor that left the medical team in quiet disarray. A human woman sat on a makeshift cot with a visibly swollen ankle. She grimaced but waved off Kellier as he approached with a portable scanner. "It's just a sprain. Wrap it up, and I'll be fine." Kellier paused, his voice cautious. "Your soft tissue damage indicates a severe strain. You should remain immobile until proper regenerative procedures." The woman cut him off with a snort. "Immobilized? I have work to finish. Just tape it." Nearby, another human lay back on a bench, holding an ice pack to his side. His ribs were clearly fractured, yet he seemed more annoyed than distressed. "Broke a couple ribs last year playing soccer," he muttered when Scythel approached. "Hurts like hell, but I know the drill. No need to fuss." For the Zephyri, this casual dismissal of pain was deeply unsettling. On their homeworld, even minor injuries required immediate and extensive treatment. A cracked exoskeletal plate could immobilize a Zephyri for weeks, their delicate systems unable to tolerate strain. Yet here were humans, brushing off injuries that should have rendered them incapacitated. The real shock came when the team encountered a man lying in the corner of the cargo hold. His back was propped awkwardly against the crate, his face pale but calm. Scythel immediately noted the unnatural angle of his lower body. The scanner confirmed a spinal injury, a trauma that, by Zephyri standards, was nothing short of catastrophic. Scythel knelt beside him, her voice steady but urgent. "Do not move. Your spinal column has sustained significant damage. We need to begin neural stabilization immediately to prevent permanent paralysis." The man gave a weak laugh. "Relax, document. It's not my first rodeo. I'll be fine." Her brows furrowed, the transparent ridges above her eyes catching the dim light. "Fine? Your spinal integrity is compromised. Without intervention." Yeah, he interrupted. "I slipped a disc once back on Earth. Hurt like hell for months, but I'm still kicking." He shifted slightly, grimacing, but his tone remained casual. "This? Just feels like that but a bit worse. Give me a brace, and I'll manage." Kellier interjected, his voice incredulous. "Your spinal injury is severe enough to cause permanent damage. This is not something to manage. You require immediate and advanced medical care." The man grinned, though the strain in his eyes was evident. "You guys are too uptight. Worst case scenario, I'll be walking funny for a while. I've had worse." That phrase, "I've had worse," seemed to be a mantra among the humans. As Scythel prepared to administer a sedative to keep the man still, he continued talking, recounting a story about falling out of a tree as a child and breaking both legs. "Doctor said I'd never walk right again," he said with a chuckle. "But here I am, still climbing." The other humans chimed in with their own tales of survival. One had been mauled by a bear and lived to tell the tale. Another spoke of tumbling off a cliff during a hiking trip and escaping with only a broken arm. Each story seemed more absurd than the last, yet they told them with a strange pride, as if pain and adversity were badges of honor. As the Zephyri team worked, a debate arose among them. Kellier, ever cautious, voiced his concerns. "These humans are reckless. They downplay injuries that would incapacitate most species. How can they hope to survive in space if they refuse proper care?" Scythel didn't respond immediately, her hands steady as she secured the spinal injury patient to a portable stretcher. Finally she said, "It's not recklessness. It's something else. Adaptability, perhaps. They've evolved to endure conditions we cannot imagine." Kellier shook his head. "Endurance has its limits. They take unnecessary risks. This man refuses proper stabilization, yet he may suffer permanent consequences." The man, overhearing, laughed again. "Permanent consequences? Nah. Humans bounce back. We're stubborn like that." Despite her concerns, Scythel couldn't deny the evidence in front of her. The humans didn't just endure pain, they seemed to thrive in spite of it. It was a resilience that bordered on the unnatural, a defiance of biological logic. The spinal injury patient became the embodiment of this defiance when, against all advice, he insisted on leaving the medbay under his own power. Sciathel protested, her tone uncharacteristically sharp. "You cannot walk. Your spine needs time to heal." "I can't or I shouldn't?" he countered with a grin. Using a makeshift crutch fashioned from a broken tool handle, he pushed himself upright, wincing but determined. "See? Not so bad." The Zephyri stood frozen, their delicate frames incapable of conceiving such reckless determination. Sciathel watched him limp toward his crewmates, each step a reminder of the stark differences between their species. For the humans, pain was not a limitation, it was an inconvenience. The Zephyri medical team gathered in the observation chamber, surrounded by holographic displays of the data collected during their triage. Every screen showed something baffling: bone structures that endured fractures without shattering, muscle fibers that regenerated faster than expected, and blood samples teeming with an immune response far more aggressive than any they had encountered. Sciathel gestured to one of the displays, her voice a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "Their skeletal system. It's not just dense, it's layered for impact resistance. Fractures are localized and rarely spread. And this," she pointed to a model highlighting microscopic healing activity. "Their bones repair themselves rapidly, almost recklessly. There's no precision, just speed." Kellier frowned, leaning closer to examine the data. "It's inefficient. Rapid healing like this should leave deformities or weaknesses. And yet, their mobility remains unaffected. How?" "Adrenaline," another medic interjected, calling up a separate display. "Humans flood their systems with it in response to injury. It dulls pain, enhances their strength temporarily, and likely accelerates their recovery. But this level of pain tolerance," he trailed off, shaking his head. "It's as if their biology was designed for constant trauma." Sciathel stepped back, considering the broader implications. "Not designed. Adapted. Their planet forged them. A death world would demand this kind of resilience, constant threats, constant danger. They evolved to survive." Kellier scoffed lightly, still unconvinced. "Survival at what cost? Look at their immune system. It's barbaric. Their bodies fight every intrusion with overwhelming force, even at the risk of self-damage. These inflammatory markers, do they ever stop attacking themselves?" "Sometimes," Sciathel said dryly. "When they're not dying from infections that would annihilate us all." The room fell silent as they digested the data. For the Zephyri, every aspect of human biology seemed contradictory, chaotic, and entirely unoptimized. Yet the results spoke for themselves. Humans were alive, functional, and, against all odds, thriving. One of the younger medics, Rylos, hesitated before speaking. "I remember fracturing a limb during my early training. A simple slip during a simulation." His voice softened with the memory. "It took 3 months of biofusion treatments and restricted movement before I could walk again. The pain..." He paused, translucent fingers twitching. "The pain was unbearable, even with suppressants. I can't imagine enduring something worse, much less joking about it." Sciathel nodded, her expression contemplative. "It's not pain tolerance alone. It's their minds. They frame suffering as temporary, even trivial. That miner with the spinal injury, he walked away because he believes he can recover. Belief alone might carry them further than logic ever would." Rylos seemed skeptical. "Is that resilience or recklessness? Belief won't save him if his injury worsens." "Perhaps," Sciathel replied. "But it's belief that keeps them moving. Their bodies evolved for endurance, but their minds refuse to give up." The conversation shifted as the team began to discuss broader implications. Most intergalactic species, including the Zephyri, had evolved in stable environments where cooperation and avoidance of risk were paramount. Their bodies and minds reflected this, prioritizing caution and conservation of energy over confrontation or endurance. Physical challenges were rare, injuries were even rarer. Humans, by contrast, seemed to come from a world designed to test survival at every turn. Predators, natural disasters, volatile climates, these were constants for early humans. To endure such conditions, they had developed what the Zephyri now saw as an almost alien toughness. They evolved in chaos, Kellier murmured. A world that demanded they keep fighting or die. We evolved in peace, where avoiding harm was survival. How can we possibly relate to this? We don't need to relate, Sciathel replied. We need to understand. They are anomalies in this galaxy, dangerous anomalies. Their resilience makes them valuable allies, but also unpredictable. How do we treat a species that doesn't seem to value its own limits? The group grew quiet again, their thoughts circling the same question. Was human resilience a strength, or a liability? For every miraculous recovery, there was the risk of pushing too far, of ignoring warnings until irreparable damage was done. Finally, Rylos broke the silence. Marvel or monster, I'm not sure I'd want to share their fate. To live constantly on the edge of survival. It's unnatural. Sciathel gazed at the displays one last time, her voice soft but firm. Unnatural? Perhaps. But effective. And whether we like it or not, they're here. The galaxy will have to adapt to them just as they have adapted to their death world. The only question is whether their resilience is a gift or a curse. The stillness aboard the Asterial shattered with the wail of emergency sirens. A sharp jolt rocked the medical ship, sending equipment tumbling and lights flickering. The crew barely had time to register the tremor before an automated voice announced, "Hull breach detected. Section 7. All personnel evacuate to secure zones." Panic rippled through the Zephyri medics. Their fragile bodies, designed for precision rather than endurance, were ill-equipped for sudden physical danger. Sciathel's hands trembled as she gripped a console, her translucent skin faintly glowing with the stress hormones coursing through her veins. Around her, other medics scrambled for stability, their movements erratic. The humans, by contrast, sprang into action. Despite their injuries, they moved with purpose, their voices cutting through the chaos with calm urgency. "Where's the breach?" one of the miners barked, already moving toward a nearby control panel. "Section 7. Sciathel managed to reply, her voice strained. "But the automated seals..." "Automated seals might not hold," the miner interrupted. "We've got to reinforce it. Who's coming with me?" To Sciathel's disbelief, several injured humans, still bandaged, limping, or bruised, rose to their feet without hesitation. Among them was the spinal injury patient, leaning heavily on his makeshift crutch but radiating determination. "You shouldn't," she began, but he cut her off with a grin. "Shouldn't be walking? Yeah. Heard it before. Let's go, people." The group of humans moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. They barked orders to one another, dividing tasks seamlessly. Two headed to the breach, while others stayed to coordinate efforts in the command center. The injured miner leaned over Sciathel's console, ignoring his obvious discomfort as he studied the ship's schematics. "This area," he said, pointing to a section near the breach. "The structural integrity here's weak. If the pressure shifts, you'll lose more than just Section 7. Do you have manual reinforcements?" Sciathel struggled to process the question. "We have emergency braces in storage, but the location is..." "Show me," he demanded. She complied, and he nodded. "Perfect. We'll need 2 people to get those braces and 2 more to patch the breach. Someone hand me a communicator." As the humans coordinated, the Zephyri medics remained frozen, their panic palpable. Kellier managed to stammer. "You can't do this. You're injured. Your bodies..." "Our bodies are fine," the spinal injury patient replied, his tone firm. "Yours won't be if we don't fix this. So unless you've got a better idea, stay out of the way." The bluntness shocked Kellier into silence. Sciathel, watching the humans work, felt a strange mix of awe and unease. These beings, who should have been incapacitated, moved with a sense of camaraderie and determination she had never seen in her own kind. At the breach site, The humans worked quickly despite the rising alarms. The spinal injury patient, refusing to sit idle, assisted in anchoring one of the braces, his face pale but resolute. His movements were slower than the others, but his presence seemed to inspire confidence. When a gust of pressurized air signaled another crack in the hull, one of the miners shouted, "Hold it steady!" Without hesitation, the spinal injury patient braced his body against the failing section, straining against the pressure. His grimace spoke volumes about the pain he must have felt, but he didn't falter. Back in the command center, Scythel watched through a monitor, her heart pounding. Every instinct told her this was madness, that the human's actions would only worsen his condition. Yet there he was, holding the breach long enough for another miner to secure the reinforcement. "They're going to kill themselves," Kellier muttered beside her. "No," Scythel said quietly, her gaze fixed on the screen. "They're going to save us." As the final brace clicked into place, the breach stabilized, and the alarms fell silent. The humans collapsed into exhausted heaps, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. The spinal injury patient sank to the floor, his breathing labored but triumphant. "Not bad," he said with a weak grin. "Could have gone smoother, though." Scythel and her team rushed to the site, their medical instincts overriding their shock. She knelt beside the spinal injury patient, scanning him for further damage. His vitals were elevated, and his condition had worsened, but his expression was serene. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "Yeah, probably not," he admitted. "But you needed us. We couldn't just sit around." The other humans chuckled weakly, their camaraderie undiminished despite their exhaustion. One miner clapped the spinal injury patient on the shoulder. "You were the MVP, man. Didn't think you'd pull through, but you proved us wrong." From the perspective of the Zephyri, the humans' actions were nothing short of miraculous. Where the medics had panicked, the humans had risen to the challenge, their resilience shining brighter than ever. To Scythel, it wasn't just their physical toughness that stood out, it was their spirit. Their willingness to endure pain, to risk everything for the sake of others, was something she struggled to comprehend. As the humans were helped back to the med bay, Scythel turned to Kellier, who looked equally stunned. "Reckless," he murmured, echoing his earlier sentiment. "But effective." "They're more than that," Scythel said, her tone thoughtful. "They're indispensable. We couldn't have done this without them." The thought lingered in her mind as she watched the humans settle back into their makeshift cots, laughing and joking despite their ordeal. In them, she saw not just survivors, but something far greater, allies who could endure the impossible, and in doing so, make the impossible achievable. The med bay hummed with quiet activity, as the Zephyri medics worked to restore order in the aftermath of the hull breach. Equipment had been scattered, some systems were still offline, and the air carried the faint tang of ozone from the emergency repairs. Yet, amid the chaos, the humans lounged in their cots, laughing and trading stories as though they had just completed an ordinary shift rather than surviving a life-threatening ordeal. Scythel stood at the central console, reviewing post-crisis reports. Her gaze lingered on the medical scans of the spinal injury patient. His name, she'd learned, was Carter. By all accounts, his condition should have deteriorated drastically after the exertion. Yet the scans showed signs of recovery already underway. His blood work indicated heightened immune activity, and his fractured vertebrae showed early signs of natural fusion. It was as if his body thrived on the very stress that should have broken it. Kellier joined her, his expression unusually subdued. "They should be incapacitated," he muttered, gesturing toward the humans. "Instead, they're laughing. Planning their next ridiculous stunt, no doubt." Scythel tilted her head, watching as Carter playfully argued with another miner over whose actions had been more heroic. "They recover quickly. Not just physically, but mentally. For us, an event like this would leave scars, psychological and cultural. But for them, it seems to strengthen their bonds." Kellier sighed, his earlier skepticism giving way to grudging admiration. "I misjudged them. I thought their resilience was reckless, born of ignorance. But now I see it's deliberate. They endure not because they don't know the risks, but because they accept them. He paused, then added, almost to himself, perhaps that's why they survive where others would fall. Scythle nodded, her thoughts drifting to the broader implications of what they had witnessed. Humans were unlike any species she had encountered in her years of medical service. Their resilience wasn't just biological, it was something deeper, woven into the fabric of their being. They faced challenges head-on, not because they were fearless, but because they chose to act despite their fear. One of the younger medics approached, his usual nervous energy replaced by curiosity. "Do you think this toughness of theirs will change the galaxy?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "I mean, if all species were like them, wouldn't things be chaotic?" "Chaotic, perhaps," Scythle replied, her tone thoughtful. "But also innovative. Their willingness to take risks fosters possibilities we might never consider. It's not chaos, it's progress." Kellier leaned against the console, his gaze distant. "Maybe that's why they've come. Not to dominate or disrupt, but to show us what's possible when you refuse to be bound by fear." At that moment, Carter, now seated at the edge of his cot with a noticeable limp, called out. "Hey, Doc," he said, grinning at Scythle. "Bet I can outrun you to the medbay doors." Scythle blinked, taken aback. "You can barely stand," she pointed out. "Exactly," Carter replied, leaning on his crutch. "Gives you a fighting chance." Laughter erupted from the other humans, their camaraderie infectious. Even some of the medics, initially startled by his audacity, cracked faint smiles. Scythle shook her head, but a small grin tugged at her lips. "You're impossible," she said. "Yeah," Carter shot back. "But you love us for it." As Carter leaned back, satisfied with his little victory, Scythle turned to Kellier, who was watching the scene with a mixture of amusement and unease. "They're not what we expected," Kellier admitted quietly. "But maybe that's what makes them valuable. They'll go where we won't. Do what we can't." Scythle nodded, her gaze returning to the humans. "Perhaps Deathworlders aren't to be feared, but to be admired. After all, they walk where others dare not tread, sometimes even on broken legs." Kellier raised a brow. "You almost sound inspired." "I am," Scythle replied, her tone resolute. "And I suspect we'll need their strength more than we realize." The two medics stood in reflective silence, watching as Carter and his crew continued their light-hearted banter. In their humor, their determination, and their resilience, Scythle saw the promise of a new kind of ally, one who might just change the fate of the galaxy.